The carriage lamps flickered as Evelina Ashworth pressed her gloved hand against the cold glass, watching the lights of London rise before her like a wall of judgment she was about to walk straight into. Her heart pounded, not with excitement, but with the sharp, private fear that tonight, in front of every family that mattered, she would be looked at and then looked past. She had heard the whispers already, even before she stepped through the door. The Duke of Kelmore would be at the ball. Every mother in the county had already decided her daughter would be the one to catch his eye, and every daughter had already decided the same about herself. Evelina was not foolish enough to believe she stood a real chance. She had seen portraits of Julian Vane, Duke of Kelmore, and she had heard the stories that clung to his name like smoke to velvet. He was tall, composed, and famously difficult to impress. He had inherited his title young after his father's sudden death, and the weight of it seemed to sit on him not as a burden but as an armor, something that let him stand apart from a room even while standing in the middle of it. Men admired him. Women wanted him. And Evelina, 18 years old and painfully aware of her family's modest fortune, wanted only to survive the evening without embarrassing her mother. The ballroom, when she finally entered it, was blinding. Chandeliers dripped golden light over a sea of silk and lace, and the orchestra played something bright and quick, the kind of music meant to make the room feel alive even when half the people in it were calculating marriages like ledgers. Evelina's mother, Lady Margaret Ashworth, gripped her arm with the practiced tightness of a woman who had spent years teaching her daughter how to smile without seeming eager. "There," her mother whispered, tilting her head so slightly that only Evelina would notice. "That is him." Evelina did not need to be told. Julian Vane stood near the far end of the room, speaking with two older gentlemen, his dark coat cut with a precision that made every other man nearby look slightly unfinished by comparison. He was not laughing, not performing for the room the way some young lords did. He simply stood, listened, and occasionally offered a short, unreadable smile. There was something almost lonely about the way he held himself, though Evelina doubted anyone else in the room would call the Duke of Kelmore lonely. Men who owned that much land and that much history were rarely described that way, even when it was true. She was introduced to him only once that evening, in the careful, formal way that every unmarried woman in the room was introduced to him, one after another, as though they were being presented for inspection rather than acquaintance. Evelina curtsied. He bowed his head slightly, said something polite about the weather or the music, she could not remember which, and then his attention moved on before she had even finished her reply. It was not cruelty. It was worse than cruelty. It was indifference, the kind that did not even require effort. She told herself it did not matter. She danced with other young men that night, pleasant enough partners who complimented her eyes and her steps, and asked polite questions about her family's estate in the countryside. She laughed when it was expected and smiled when it was expected, and by the time the carriage carried her home near midnight, she had convinced herself that the evening had gone exactly as it should have. She had not embarrassed anyone. She had not been noticed by the Duke of Kelmore. Both of those things were, by the standards of that world, a kind of quiet success. But alone in her room, with the candle burning low and her mother's hopeful words still echoing faintly down the hallway, Evelina allowed herself one small, private disappointment. She had not expected to be chosen. She had not even truly hoped for it. And yet there had been some small, foolish part of her that had wanted, just for a moment, to be seen by him the way he seemed to see everything else in that room, with that quiet, assessing attention that made people either preen or shrink. She had done neither. She had simply not existed to him at all. The following weeks brought more balls, more introductions, more careful conversations about who had danced with whom and who had been seen walking in which garden with which gentleman. Evelina attended each one with the same quiet determination, refusing to let herself dwell too long on the Duke's continued indifference. She saw him often enough, across rooms near refreshment tables, once even seated 2 chairs away from her at a dinner party where he spoke at length to the woman on his other side, and said perhaps 4 words to Evelina the entire evening. She began to understand, slowly and without bitterness, that she simply was not the kind of woman men like Julian Vane noticed. She was not the wittiest in the room, nor the most beautiful, nor the daughter of the wealthiest family. She was pleasant, well-mannered, and easily forgotten, and there was a strange kind of peace in accepting that early, rather than spending years chasing an attention that would never come. Her closest friend that season was a young woman named Charlotte Byron, whose family had known the Ashworths for years, and who possessed a sharp tongue that Evelina found endlessly entertaining, even when it was aimed at her own worries. It was Charlotte who first noticed how often Evelina's gaze drifted toward the Duke across crowded rooms, even as Evelina insisted she felt nothing but mild curiosity. "You watch him the way one watches weather," Charlotte said one evening, fanning herself lazily as they stood near the edge of a dance floor. "As though you are simply monitoring whether it will rain, nothing more." "I am not watching him," Evelina said, though her eyes had, in fact, just found him again, standing near the terrace doors, deep in conversation with his aunt, a formidable older woman named Lady Constance Vane who seemed to accompany him everywhere. "I am watching the room. He simply happens to be in it." Charlotte laughed, not unkindly. "He happens to be in every room you are ever in, apparently. How convenient for your studies of weather." Evelina did not argue further, mostly because she suspected Charlotte was not entirely wrong. There was something about the Duke that drew the eye even when one did not wish it to. Perhaps it was simply his rank, the way title and fortune made a man seem larger than his actual presence warranted. Perhaps it was something else entirely, something in the careful stillness he carried, as though he were always holding something back. Evelina did not allow herself to wonder which it was for very long. She had learned in only a handful of weeks that hoping for the attention of a man like Julian Vane was a fast and certain way to spend a season in quiet misery, and she had no intention of doing that to herself. As the weeks passed, Evelina found herself settling into a rhythm she had not expected to enjoy. She danced with pleasant, unremarkable young men who would likely never be remembered by history, but who were kind enough in the moment. She attended garden parties where she learned to identify flowers she had never known the names of, and she spent long afternoons with Charlotte discussing everything from the absurdity of certain fashionable hats to the quiet ambitions both of them harbored beneath their polite exteriors. Evelina began, slowly, to enjoy her own company in a way she had not expected a first season to allow. Still, there were moments that stung more than she would have admitted aloud. Once, at a musical evening hosted by a family friend, she watched the Duke enter the room and immediately be surrounded by a cluster of young women, all vying subtly for a place near him, all laughing a fraction too loudly at whatever he said. Evelina remained seated near the back with Charlotte, watching the performance unfold with the detached interest of someone observing a play rather than participating in one. "Do you suppose he ever tires of it?" Charlotte murmured, watching the same scene. "All that attention, it must be exhausting to be wanted by so many people who know nothing real about you." "I would not know," Evelina said dryly. "I have had the opposite experience entirely." Charlotte glanced at her, something softer crossing her expression. "Give it time. Seasons are long, and men like that are not always so blind." Evelina did not believe her, not truly, but she appreciated the kindness in the words all the same. She had no illusions about her position in that room. She was the daughter of a respectable but unremarkable family, pleasant enough to look at but not striking, clever enough to hold a conversation but not so clever as to be memorable. She had watched enough seasons unfold from the sidelines of her own family's gatherings to understand exactly what kind of match she was likely to make, and it was not going to be a duke. Near the end of that first season, at what would be one of the last grand balls before families began retreating to their country estates for the summer, Evelina found herself standing near an open window, grateful for the cool evening air after an hour of dancing. She was not looking for the Duke. She had by then largely stopped looking for him at all, having accepted his indifference as simply a fact of the world, like the changing seasons or the unpredictability of English weather. And yet, as she turned from the window, she found herself only a few feet from him, close enough that she could have spoken if she had wanted to. He did not seem to notice her at first. He was watching the dance floor with that same unreadable expression he seemed to wear at every gathering, as though he were perpetually calculating something no one else could see. For a brief, unguarded moment, Evelina studied his face the way she rarely allowed herself to, searching for whatever it was that made an entire ballroom orbit around him. She found, to her mild surprise, that beneath the composure there was something almost tired in his eyes, a weariness that did not match the easy confidence of his posture. Then his gaze shifted briefly and met hers. For half a second, something passed between them, some small flicker of acknowledgement that made Evelina's breath catch despite herself. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. His attention moved past her, drawn by his aunt calling his name from across the room, and he inclined his head toward Evelina in the barest, most automatic of courtesies before walking away entirely. Evelina told herself it meant nothing. It was, after all, nothing. A glance, half a second, the kind of accidental eye contact that happened 100 times in any crowded room, and was forgotten within moments by everyone except, apparently, her. She returned home that night with her mother already speaking of next year's season, of new gowns and new introductions and renewed hope, and Evelina listened with polite attention while privately deciding that she would not allow herself to hope for anything at all where the Duke of Kelmore was concerned. He had looked at her once, for half a second, out of 100 nights and 1,000 glances given to other women. It was not the beginning of anything. It was simply the end of her first season, unremarkable and complete, and as her carriage rolled through the quiet streets toward home, Evelina closed her eyes and let herself feel, just for a moment, the small and private ache of being almost seen. A full year passed before Evelina Ashworth stood at the top of another staircase, looking down into another crowded ballroom, and felt the same nervous flutter she had believed she left behind with her first season. She was older now, though only by a year, and she told herself that a year was enough time to have grown wiser, calmer, less prone to foolish hoping. She had spent the months between seasons at her family's home in the countryside, walking long distances through fields she knew by heart, reading books her mother considered unsuitable, and slowly building a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with ballrooms or dukes. And yet standing there again, dressed in a gown of pale green silk that her mother had insisted would bring out the color of her eyes, Evelina felt the old uncertainty creep back in as though it had never left. She scanned the room out of habit before she could stop herself, and there, near the same terrace doors as always, stood Julian Vane, Duke of Kelmore, looking exactly as composed and exactly as untouchable as he had the year before. "You are doing it again," Charlotte Byron said beside her, amusement threading through her voice. Charlotte had grown even sharper over the past year, having survived her own difficult courtship with a gentleman who had ultimately proven unworthy of her attention, a fact she now discussed with the detached wit of someone who had learned an important lesson and did not intend to repeat the mistake. "Doing what?" Evelina said, though she already knew. "Counting him among the furniture the moment you enter a room. I do wonder if you realize you do it." Evelina forced her attention away from the terrace doors and toward the refreshment table, determined to prove Charlotte wrong, though she suspected the attempt was already too late to be convincing. "I assure you, I have no particular interest in the Duke of Kelmore. He has made his lack of interest in me abundantly clear." "Has he?" Charlotte said, arching an eyebrow. "Or has he simply never had the opportunity to form an opinion of you at all, which strikes me as an entirely different matter?" It was, Evelina had to admit, an entirely fair point, though she did not enjoy hearing it stated so plainly. In the whole of the previous season, she and the Duke had exchanged perhaps a dozen words total, spread across several months and several gatherings, none of them memorable enough to have left any lasting impression on him whatsoever. She was, to him, simply one face among the dozens introduced to him each year, one name he likely could not recall without prompting. This season, Evelina had promised herself, would be different, not because she intended to pursue the Duke's attention, but because she intended to stop measuring the success of her evenings against whether or not she received it. She had new friends now, women she had met through Charlotte and through her mother's expanding circle of acquaintances, and she found herself genuinely enjoying their company in a way that had little to do with marriage prospects at all. There was a young woman named Margaret Ellison who shared her love of long country walks, and another, a widow far too young to be won, named Isabel Faraday, who possessed an irreverent sense of humor that made even the dullest gatherings bearable. It was through Isabel, in fact, that Evelina first heard the rumors that would occupy much of the Tun's conversation that season. The Duke of Kelmore, it was whispered, was finally beginning to consider marriage in earnest, having spent several years resisting the pressure from his family to secure the succession. His aunt, the formidable Lady Constance Vane, had reportedly taken it upon herself to compile a list of suitable candidates, women of appropriate rank and fortune, whose families had histories long enough, and estates prosperous enough to satisfy even the most demanding standards. "I heard it is nearly a dozen names," Isabel said one afternoon, over tea in the Ashworth family's modest but comfortable drawing-room. "Lady Fenwick's daughter chief among them, of course. Rosalind Fenwick has been groomed for exactly this outcome since the day she was born, or so her mother would have everyone believe." Evelina, stirring her tea with more attention than the task required, kept her expression carefully neutral. "It seems a rather clinical way to choose a wife." "Dukes are rarely permitted romance," Isabel said with a shrug that suggested she found the entire arrangement both absurd and entirely unsurprising. "Land and title do not care for love, they care for lineage." Evelina said nothing further on the matter, though she thought about it more than she cared to admit over the following days. Rosalind Fenwick was, by every account, a formidable candidate for the position, beautiful in the way that seemed almost designed rather than natural, accomplished in music and languages, and possessed of a fortune large enough to make even the Duke's considerable holdings seem modest by comparison. Evelina had met her only twice, both times briefly, and had come away from each encounter with the distinct impression that Rosalind Fenwick knew precisely how the world worked, and intended to make it work entirely in her favor. It should not have mattered to Evelina who the Duke chose to court. She told herself this repeatedly throughout the season, usually in the quiet moments before sleep, when her mind seemed most inclined to wander toward thoughts she had no business entertaining. And yet she found herself watching, more than she would have liked, the careful dance unfolding around Julian Vane at every gathering, the way certain young women seemed to appear at his elbow with suspicious regularity, the way his aunt steered him toward particular conversations with the precision of a woman playing chess rather than attending a ball. At a garden party hosted by the Fenwick family themselves, an event that felt, to Evelina, almost transparently designed to showcase Rosalind's many accomplishments, Evelina found herself seated at some distance from the main gathering, content to watch the proceedings from beneath the shade of a large oak tree, while Charlotte and Isabel discussed the merits of various young men in low, amused voices beside her. "He does look rather trapped," Charlotte observed, nodding toward where the Duke stood beside Rosalind Fenwick near a rose garden, listening to her play a small, ornamental piece on a garden harp that had apparently been arranged specifically for the occasion. "Like a man attending his own funeral and being asked to compliment the flowers." Evelina could not help the small smile that crossed her face at the observation, though she quickly schooled her expression when she noticed Isabel watching her with knowing amusement. "It is not our place to comment on how the Duke chooses to spend his afternoon." "No," Isabel agreed cheerfully, "but it is certainly our place to enjoy watching him endure it." The afternoon wore on in pleasant, unremarkable fashion, filled with polite conversation, and the particular boredom that came from watching other people's carefully staged courtships unfold. It was only as the gathering began to thin, guests drifting toward their carriages as the sun dipped lower, that Evelina found herself unexpectedly near the Duke again, this time in the relative quiet of a garden path away from the main gathering, having wandered there alone to collect her thoughts before the ride home. He seemed as surprised to see her as she was to see him, his expression shifting briefly from its usual careful composure into something closer to genuine curiosity. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and Evelina felt a small, foolish jolt of surprise that he remembered her name at all. "Your Grace," she replied, offering the expected curtsy, though her mind was already racing to understand what precisely she was meant to say next. Their previous conversations, few as they had been, had never extended beyond the barest pleasantries. "You have escaped the harp performance as well, I see," he said, and there was something in his tone, something dry and almost self-deprecating, that caught Evelina entirely off guard. "I confess I found I needed air," she said carefully, unsure how much honesty was appropriate. "Though I understand Miss Fenwick's talents are considerable." "They are," he agreed, though something in his expression suggested the observation brought him little pleasure. "Considerable and considerably discussed at every gathering I have attended this season." Evelina was not entirely certain what to make of the comment, nor of the strange, unguarded quality in his voice as he said it, as though for a brief moment he had forgotten to maintain the careful distance he kept from nearly everyone. She wondered, not for the first time, what it must be like to be a man so constantly observed, so constantly measured against a list of expectations he had likely never chosen for himself. "It must be exhausting," she said before she could stop herself, "being so thoroughly discussed." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or something closer to gratitude for the acknowledgement. "You are the first person to say so plainly, Miss Ashworth. Most simply wish to add their own opinions to the discussion." "I have very few opinions on the matter," Evelina said honestly. "I am afraid I know very little about you beyond what everyone else already knows." He studied her for a long moment, an expression she could not quite read settling over his features, and Evelina had the distinct sense that she had said something unexpected, something that did not fit neatly into the conversations he was accustomed to having in gardens with young women during his season of careful courtship. Before he could respond, however, his aunt's voice carried across the garden, calling his name with the particular urgency of a woman who had noticed her nephew's absence and intended to remedy it immediately. "I must go," he said, and there was, Evelina thought, the faintest note of reluctance in his voice, though she told herself she was likely imagining it. "It was a pleasure, Miss Ashworth." "Your Grace," she said, offering another curtsy as he departed, and then stood alone on the garden path for a long moment, watching him walk away, replaying the brief exchange in her mind with a thoroughness she knew was foolish. It was, she reminded herself firmly, nothing. A few minutes of conversation, prompted only by chance and the shared desire to escape a tedious performance. It did not mean he had noticed her, not truly, not in the way that mattered. And yet, as the season wore on, and the rumors of his eventual engagement to Rosalind Fenwick grew louder and more insistent with each passing week, Evelina found herself thinking of that garden conversation more often than she cared to admit, holding it close like a small, private treasure she had no right to keep. By the time her second season drew to its close, no formal announcement had been made regarding the Duke's engagement, despite the widespread expectation that one was imminent. Evelina overheard, in the final weeks before families began departing for the summer, whispers suggesting that negotiations between the Kelmore and Fenwick families had stalled over some matter of settlement, though no one seemed entirely certain of the details. Rosalind Fenwick herself had grown noticeably cooler toward the Duke in public, a fact that fueled endless speculation among the ton's most devoted gossips. Evelina, for her part, tried to think as little of the matter as possible, though she found it a more difficult task than she had anticipated. She had entered her second season telling herself she expected nothing from Julian Vane, and she left it with the uncomfortable realization that some small, stubborn part of her had begun to hope regardless, despite every reasonable argument against doing so. As her carriage carried her home for the final time that season, past the same familiar streets and the same fading evening light, Evelina resolved, with more determination than she had managed the year before, that her third season would be different. She would not spend it waiting for a man who had given her no real reason to wait. She would build a life of her own choosing, regardless of whether the Duke of Kelmore ever noticed her at all. By the time Evelina Ashworth entered her third season, she had stopped counting the number of times she had watched Julian Vane, Duke of Kelmore, cross a crowded ballroom without so much as a glance in her direction. She had also, more importantly, stopped allowing that fact to shape the way she felt about herself. 20 years old now, She carried herself with a quiet confidence that had grown slowly over the past 2 years, built not from any man's attention, but from the steady accumulation of her own interests, her own friendships, and her own understanding of who she wished to become. She had taken up charitable work that season, volunteering several mornings a week at a small house that provided food and basic education to children from the poorer districts of London, an occupation her mother had initially viewed with some concern, worried it would make her daughter seem too serious, too unlike the light and playful young women dukes were meant to admire. But Evelina had found, in the quiet satisfaction of teaching a child his letters, or ensuring a family had enough to eat through a difficult month, something far more meaningful than any ballroom compliment had ever offered her. It had changed something in the way she carried herself, given her a steadiness that had nothing to do with whether or not she caught anyone's eye across a crowded room. It was through this work, in fact, that she first properly met Edmund Hale, a gentleman of modest but respectable fortune who had taken an interest in similar charitable causes, and who Evelina encountered one morning distributing bread and warm clothing to families outside the very house where she volunteered. He was not a titled man, nor a particularly wealthy one, but he possessed a quiet kindness and an easy, genuine warmth that Evelina found immediately and unexpectedly comfortable, the way one feels comfortable with an old friend rather than a new acquaintance. "You are Miss Ashworth, I believe," he said, approaching her with a friendly, unguarded smile after their initial introduction through a mutual acquaintance. "I have heard you spend your mornings here as well. It is rare to find someone of your standing who prefers this work to sleeping late and attending to correspondence." "I find I prefer useful mornings to idle ones," Evelina replied, returning his smile with genuine ease. "Though I confess, I did not expect to find a gentleman here with similar preferences. My mother taught me that a title, or the lack of one, means very little if a man does nothing worthwhile with his time," Edmund said. "I have tried to hold to that, though I admit it makes for considerably less exciting conversation at dinner parties." Evelina laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that surprised her with its ease, and found herself, over the following weeks, looking forward to her mornings at the house not only for the work itself, but for the growing friendship that developed between them there. Edmund Hale was not a man who set the ballroom alight with his presence, nor one whose name was whispered with the same breathless anticipation as the Duke of Kelmore's. But he was steady, attentive, and genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions in a way that Evelina had never experienced from any man before, titled or otherwise. Charlotte Byron, upon meeting him for the first time at a small gathering hosted by Evelina's mother, pronounced her verdict with characteristic bluntness. "He looks at you the way most men look at their favorite hunting dog," she said, watching Edmund across the room as he laughed at something Evelina's younger brother had said. "Devoted, warm, entirely unable to imagine looking anywhere else." "That is a rather strange compliment," Evelina said, though she could not entirely suppress her own smile. "It is meant as one," Charlotte assured her. "You could do far worse than a man who cannot stop watching you, Evelina, even if he lacks a title impressive enough to satisfy your mother's ambitions." Evelina's mother, in truth, had mixed feelings about the growing friendship between her daughter and Edmund Hale. Lady Margaret Ashworth had spent 3 seasons now hoping, with steadily diminishing conviction, that her daughter might attract the attention of someone considerably grander, and Edmund's modest fortune and lack of title represented, in her mind, a quiet admission of defeat. But even she could not deny the genuine happiness that seemed to settle over Evelina whenever his name was mentioned, nor the steady, comfortable way the two of them seemed to fit together whenever they were in company. It was during this same season that Evelina's path crossed the Duke's more frequently than it had in either of her previous 2, a fact she attributed to nothing more than the natural expansion of her social circle, rather than any change in her own feelings toward him. She saw him at balls and dinners and the occasional garden party, always surrounded by the same careful arrangement of ambitious mothers and hopeful daughters, always maintaining that same composed distance that had characterized every interaction she had ever witnessed him having with anyone outside his immediate family. The rumored engagement to Rosalind Fenwick, it emerged, had indeed collapsed sometime over the previous winter, though the details remained the subject of considerable speculation among the ton. Some claimed the Fenwick family had demanded settlement terms the Duke found unreasonable. Others suggested Rosalind herself had grown tired of a courtship that never seemed to progress toward genuine affection. Whatever the truth, the Duke had entered his 4th season of eligibility, as the gossips liked to call it, with his aunt reportedly more determined than ever to see him settled, and the ton's collective attention had turned once again toward speculating who might finally succeed where Rosalind Fenwick had failed. Evelina found, to her own quiet surprise, that she cared considerably less about this speculation than she once might have. She still noticed him, of course, still felt that familiar small flutter whenever their paths crossed at some gathering or another, but the feeling had settled into something calmer now, something closer to fond acknowledgement than desperate hope. She had Edmund's steady friendship to occupy her thoughts, and her charitable work to occupy her mornings, and a growing sense of her own worth that no longer depended on whether the most sought-after man in London chose to look her way. It was at a masquerade ball, one of the final grand events of that 3rd season, that Evelina found herself once again in the Duke's company, though the circumstances of the encounter were unlike any that had come before. The event had drawn an enormous crowd, everyone hidden behind elaborate masks that made even familiar faces briefly mysterious, and Evelina, dressed in a gown of deep blue with a matching mask that covered the upper half of her face, found the anonymity oddly liberating. She had wandered onto a quiet balcony overlooking the gardens, seeking a moment's respite from the crush of the ballroom, when she became aware of another figure already standing there, gazing out over the darkened lawn below. The mask he wore, black and simply designed, could not entirely disguise the particular stillness of his posture, and Evelina recognized him almost immediately, though she said nothing at first, unwilling to disturb whatever private thoughts had drawn him out into the night air. "You need not announce yourself, Miss Ashworth," he said, without turning, and Evelina startled slightly at the sound of her own name. "How did you know it was me?" she asked, moving to stand a respectful distance from him along the balcony railing. "I have grown reasonably good at recognizing you, even in disguise," he said, and there was something almost wry in his tone. "You have a particular way of entering a room quietly, as though hoping not to be noticed, which is, I think, rather more noticeable than you realize." Evelina considered this observation for a moment, unsure whether to feel embarrassed or pleased that he had apparently formed some impression of her habits after all, despite 3 seasons of what she had always assumed was mutual near invisibility. "I did not realize your Grace paid such close attention to how young women enter rooms." "I do not generally," he admitted, and something in his voice suggested the admission surprised even him. "I find most of it rather tiresome, if I am honest. The careful entrances, the practiced laughter, the way every conversation seems designed to lead toward some conclusion about marriage settlements before it has properly begun." "And yet you continue to attend," Evelina observed. "Duty rarely asks for enthusiasm," he said. "Only attendance." They stood in companionable silence for a while after that, watching the distant lanterns strung through the garden below, and Evelina found herself unexpectedly comfortable in the quiet, unhurried nature of the exchange, so unlike the brief, formal pleasantries that had characterized every previous conversation between them. She wondered briefly what had changed, whether it was simply the anonymity of the masks or something else entirely, something she did not have the courage to name even in her own thoughts. "I understand congratulations were nearly in order last year," she said eventually, immediately wondering if the observation was too forward, though something in the easy quiet of the evening had made her bolder than usual. "Nearly," he agreed, without apparent offense, "though I confess I felt considerable relief when the matter resolved itself otherwise. It is a strange thing to be relieved by the failure of one's own engagement." Perhaps it was simply not the right match, Evelina offered carefully. Perhaps, he said, turning to look at her directly for the first time since she had joined him on the balcony, his eyes, even partially obscured by the mask, holding an intensity that made Evelina's breath catch unexpectedly. I have found myself wondering, more than once this past year, what the right match might actually look like, beyond the considerations of fortune and lineage everyone insists upon. Evelina did not know how to respond to this, nor was she given the opportunity to try, as the sound of approaching voices from the ballroom signaled the imminent arrival of other guests, seeking the same quiet respite they had found. The Duke straightened almost imperceptibly, the careful composure returning to his posture like a mask settling back into place, and Evelina understood, without being told, that whatever brief honesty had passed between them on that balcony was not meant to survive the return to company. "I should return to the ballroom," he said, his tone once again formal, distant, the voice of a duke rather than the voice of a man who had, moments before, spoken with unguarded uncertainty about his own future. "It was a pleasure, Miss Ashworth." "Your Grace," she said, offering the expected curtsy as he departed, and stood alone on the balcony for several long minutes afterward, replaying the strange, unexpected conversation in her mind, uncertain what to make of it, uncertain whether it meant anything at all beyond the particular honesty that masks and moonlight sometimes encouraged in people who would never speak so freely in the full light of a crowded room. She did not see him again for the remainder of that season, at least not in any circumstance that allowed for private conversation, and by the time she returned home for the summer, she had largely convinced herself that the balcony exchange had been nothing more than a strange, isolated moment, born of masks and moonlight, and nothing more lasting than that. Edmund Hale's steady friendship continued to grow throughout those final weeks, his attentions becoming gradually more pointed, more clearly the beginnings of genuine courtship rather than simple friendship, and Evelina found herself, for the first time in 3 seasons, genuinely uncertain about her own heart, caught between the steady, certain warmth Edmund offered and the strange, unshakable pull she still felt whenever she thought of a masked balcony conversation with a duke who had, for one brief moment, allowed her to see something real beneath his careful composure. The invitation to Lord Ravensworth's country house arrived at the Ashworth home in late summer, a thick cream envelope bearing a seal that made Evelina's mother nearly drop her teacup from excitement. A fortnight in the countryside, hosted by one of the most respected families in England, with guests drawn from across the finest circles of society, was precisely the kind of gathering that could make or unmake a young woman's prospects, and Lady Margaret Ashworth had spent the better part of an hour discussing which gowns would need to be altered before their departure. Evelina accepted the invitation with considerably less enthusiasm than her mother displayed, though she could not entirely suppress a small flicker of curiosity when she learned, through Charlotte, that the Duke of Kelmore was expected among the guests as well. She told herself the information meant nothing to her particular plans for the fortnight, and largely believed it, having spent the intervening months since the masquerade ball convincing herself that whatever strange honesty had passed between them on that balcony had been an isolated occurrence, unlikely to repeat itself in the ordinary light of day. Edmund Hale, unfortunately, had not been invited to Ravensworth Hall, his family's more modest standing placing them outside the narrow circle Lord Ravensworth typically entertained, a fact that left Evelina feeling an unexpected pang of loneliness as her carriage rolled through the gates of the grand estate 2 weeks later. She had grown accustomed, over the past several months, to his steady presence at nearly every gathering she attended, his easy conversation and genuine warmth becoming something she relied upon more than she had fully realized until faced with a fortnight without it. Ravensworth Hall itself was magnificent, a sprawling estate of golden stone set among rolling green hills, with gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon and a lake so still and clear that it perfectly mirrored the sky above it. Evelina found herself, within the first day of arrival, genuinely charmed by the setting, despite her initial reluctance to attend, and she quickly fell into an easy rhythm with the other young women staying at the house, most of whom she knew at least casually from previous seasons. It was on the second morning, during a walk through the extensive gardens that had been arranged for the ladies, while the gentlemen occupied themselves with shooting elsewhere on the estate, that Evelina first properly encountered the Duke again, quite by accident, as he emerged from a wooded path, apparently having taken an early solitary walk of his own before the day's planned activities began. "Miss Ashworth," he said, seeming as genuinely surprised by the encounter as she was, though he recovered his composure quickly, offering the expected bow. "I did not realize you had been invited to Ravensworth Hall." "Nor I you, your grace, though I confess I should have expected it," Evelina replied, matching his composure with some effort of her own. "Lord Ravensworth's guest lists rarely omit dukes." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "You make it sound as though I am invited purely for decoration." "Are you not?" she asked, before she could fully consider the boldness of the question, and was rewarded with an actual laugh, low and unguarded, unlike anything she had heard from him before. "Perhaps," he admitted, "though I would prefer to believe Lord Ravensworth values my company for reasons beyond my title." They fell into step together along the garden path, the other ladies having wandered ahead, and Evelina found herself, for the second time that year, engaged in a conversation with the Duke that felt genuinely unguarded, free of the careful formality that had characterized nearly every previous interaction between them. He asked, with what seemed like real interest, about her charitable work, and listened with genuine attention as she described the children she taught, and the small satisfactions of watching a struggling student finally grasp their letters. "I confess I know very little of such work," he admitted, as they paused near a stone bridge overlooking the estate's ornamental lake. "My days are occupied with matters of land and tenant management, which feel important in the abstract, but rarely offer the kind of immediate satisfaction you describe. Perhaps you have simply never had the opportunity to discover otherwise," Evelina suggested. "Perhaps," he said, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. "You have a way of suggesting rather bold things very gently, Miss Ashworth. I find I cannot quite decide whether to be offended or grateful." "I would recommend gratitude," she said lightly. "It is generally the more pleasant option." Over the following days, their paths crossed with increasing, if seemingly accidental, frequency during morning walks and afternoon garden gatherings, and the occasional quiet moment away from the main group of guests. Evelina told herself each encounter was coincidental, the natural result of two people staying under the same roof for an extended period, but she could not entirely ignore the growing sense that the Duke seemed to be seeking out her company deliberately, in a way he had never done during 3 full seasons in London. Lady Constance Vane, who had also joined the party at Ravensworth Hall, seemed to notice this shift as well, watching Evelina with an expression that mixed curiosity with something closer to wariness whenever her nephew's attention drifted toward the young woman during dinner conversations or evening entertainments. Evelina, aware of the older woman's scrutiny, found herself increasingly self-conscious, uncertain whether she was imagining a connection that did not truly exist or whether something genuine had, against all reasonable expectation, begun to take shape. It was during a boating excursion on the estate's lake, arranged for the entertainment of the younger guests, that matters came to something of a head. Evelina found herself paired, through what she suspected was Lady Ravensworth's deliberate arrangement, in a small boat with the Duke himself, while the other guests scattered across several other vessels, their laughter carrying faintly across the still water. "I hope you do not object to the arrangement," he said, as he took up the oars with practiced ease. "I suspect our hostess has taken rather too keen an interest in my marital prospects." "I had not noticed," Evelina said, though her tone suggested otherwise, and he laughed again, that same low, unguarded sound she had come to appreciate more than she cared to admit. "You are a poor liar, Miss Ashworth." "I have never claimed to be skilled at deception," she replied. "It seems a rather exhausting way to move through the world." He rode in comfortable silence for a while after that, the only sounds the gentle splash of the oars and the distant calls of birds from the surrounding woods. And Evelina found herself studying his profile with a boldness she would never have permitted herself in the crowded confines of a London ballroom. There was something different in him here, away from the constant scrutiny of society, something looser and more genuine that she had glimpsed only briefly before, at the masquerade ball, and had begun to wonder if she had imagined entirely. "May I ask you something rather forward?" he said eventually, resting the oars and letting the small boat drift gently across the still water. "You may ask," Evelina said carefully, "though I make no promises regarding my answer." "Why did you never seek my attention?" he asked, his expression unusually serious, "during your first season or your second?" "I have observed enough young women pursuing my company over the years to recognize the pattern immediately. And yet you never did, not once in 3 years." Evelina considered the question for a long moment, unsure how much honesty the situation truly warranted, before deciding that some measure of truth was owed, given the strange intimacy the fortnight had built between them. "I did not believe it would be welcomed, Your Grace. You showed very little interest in my company during my first season, and I concluded, reasonably I believe, that pursuing your attention would be a waste of both our time." "That seems," he said slowly, "a remarkably sensible conclusion, and yet I find myself somewhat disappointed by it." "Disappointed," Evelina repeated, genuinely startled by the admission. "I have spent 3 seasons surrounded by women who pursued my attention relentlessly, for reasons that had little to do with any genuine interest in my character," he said, his gaze fixed on the water rather than on her, as though the admission required some measure of distance to voice honestly. "I did not realize, until quite recently, how much I had come to value the company of someone who never sought it at all." Evelina did not know how to respond to this, her heart pounding with a confusion of emotions she could not fully untangle, and before she could find the words, the sound of another boat approaching, filled with laughing guests calling out to arrange a race across the lake, interrupted whatever moment might have followed. The Duke straightened, that familiar composure settling once again over his features, and the conversation, like so many before it, was left unfinished, hanging in the air between them like a question neither seemed quite ready to answer fully. The remainder of the fortnight passed in a haze of half-finished conversations and stolen glances that Evelina told herself meant nothing, even as she found herself increasingly unable to convince herself of that fact. She thought often of Edmund Hale during those days, of his steady warmth and genuine devotion, and felt a growing guilt at the confusion taking root in her heart, uncertain whether it was fair to either man to feel so thoroughly divided in her affections. By the time her carriage departed Ravensworth Hall for the journey home, Evelina had reached no clear conclusion regarding her own feelings, only a growing awareness that the quiet, comfortable understanding she had built with Edmund Hale over the preceding months now existed alongside something else entirely, something unexpected and unsettling that she had never anticipated feeling for a man who had spent 3 full seasons treating her as though she barely existed at all. She watched the estate grow smaller through the carriage window, uncertain whether she was relieved or regretful to be leaving, and resolved, with the particular determination that had carried her through 3 difficult seasons already, to sort through her tangled feelings before allowing them to affect any decision that would shape the rest of her life. Autumn settled over London with its usual gray skies and early darkness, and Evelina Ashworth found herself, in the weeks following her return from Ravensworth Hall, spending more time in Edmund Hale's company than ever before. He had called upon her family within days of her arrival home, bringing with him a small basket of late-season fruit from his family's modest orchard, and an eagerness to hear every detail of her fortnight away, though Evelina found herself, guiltily, editing certain portions of the story before she offered it. She told him about the gardens and the lake and the pleasant company of the other guests, but she said nothing of the quiet boat ride, nothing of the Duke's unexpected admission, nothing of the confusion that had settled into her chest like a stone she could not quite dislodge. It felt, somehow, like a betrayal to speak of it, though she could not fully articulate to herself why, given that nothing improper had actually occurred between herself and the Duke, nothing beyond conversation and the particular honesty that solitude sometimes encouraged. "You seem distracted," Edmund observed one afternoon, as they walked together through a park near her family's home, the autumn leaves crunching pleasantly beneath their feet. "I hope Ravensworth Hall did not exhaust you entirely." "I am simply tired," Evelina said, which was not entirely a lie, though it was not the full truth either. The journey home was rather long. Edmund accepted this explanation with his usual easy grace, though Evelina noticed, over the following weeks, a certain watchfulness in his manner that had not been there before, as though some part of him sensed the shift that had taken place within her without being able to name its cause. He continued his steady courtship regardless, bringing small gifts and thoughtful attentions, speaking increasingly of a future that seemed, to Evelina's growing discomfort, to assume a conclusion she had not yet fully committed to in her own heart. It was Charlotte Byron, ever perceptive, who finally forced the matter into the open, cornering Evelina during a quiet afternoon visit and refusing to be deflected by vague answers or changed subjects. "Something happened at Ravensworth Hall," she said, settling into her usual chair in the Ashworth drawing-room with the particular determination of a woman who did not intend to leave until she had extracted the full truth. "You have been strange since your return, and I have known you long enough to recognize the particular quality of your strangeness." Evelina considered denying it, but found, in the face of Charlotte's steady gaze, that she lacked the energy to maintain the pretense any longer. She told her everything then: the boat ride, the unfinished conversation, the Duke's unexpected admission, and the confusion that had settled over her ever since, tangling her feelings for Edmund with something else entirely, something she had never expected to feel and did not know how to name. Charlotte listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly thoughtful as the story unfolded, and when Evelina finally finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "You must understand," she said carefully, "that men like the Duke of Kelmore have said such things to other women before, and meant considerably less by them than you might hope. It does not mean he is insincere, only that you should be cautious before allowing his words to unravel a genuine and steady affection you already possess." "I know," Evelina said quietly. "I have told myself the same thing a dozen times since we returned, and yet—" "And yet," Charlotte agreed, not unkindly. "Feelings rarely obey good sense, however much we might wish they did." The situation grew considerably more complicated as the winter season approached, and the Tun's attention, having exhausted the previous year's speculation regarding Rosalind Fenwick, turned once again toward the Duke's unmarried status, this time with an added layer of interest generated by whispered rumors, originating from somewhere within the Ravensworth Hall guest list, that the Duke had shown particular attention to a certain Miss Ashworth during his stay in the countryside. Evelina found herself, for the first time in 3 seasons, the subject of considerable gossip, a position she found deeply uncomfortable, particularly given how little certainty she herself possessed regarding what, if anything, the Duke's attention actually meant. Edmund Hale inevitably heard the rumors as well, and though he said nothing directly to Evelina about them for several weeks, she noticed a growing tension in his manner whenever the Duke's name arose in conversation, a careful watchfulness that spoke of concerns he was too proud, or too kind, to voice outright. It was only when a mutual acquaintance mentioned, carelessly, during a dinner party, having seen the Duke and Miss Ashworth walking together at Ravensworth Hall on more than one occasion, that Edmund finally addressed the matter directly, requesting a private conversation as he escorted Evelina home following the gathering. "I do not wish to seem the kind of man who demands explanations," he said, his voice carefully measured though Evelina could hear the genuine hurt beneath it. "But I find I cannot continue pretending I have not heard the rumors, nor that they have not troubled me considerably." Evelina, walking beside him in the cool evening air, felt a wave of guilt so sharp it nearly stole her breath entirely. "Edmund, I have not encouraged anything improper between myself and the Duke. We spoke, during my stay at Ravensworth Hall on several occasions, but nothing occurred that would justify the gossip that has apparently followed. "I believe you," he said, and Evelina could hear that he meant it genuinely, which somehow made the conversation feel even harder to bear. "But I have known you long enough now to sense when something troubles you, Evelina, and I do not believe your distraction these past weeks has been entirely without cause." Evelina did not respond immediately, uncertain how much honesty the moment required, torn between her genuine affection for the steady, kind man walking beside her, and the confusing, unresolved feelings that had taken root during a single conversation on a still lake weeks earlier. "I do not know my own heart as clearly as I would wish," she said finally, the admission costing her considerable effort. "I care for you deeply, Edmund, more than I have cared for any man before you. But I would be dishonest if I claimed the Duke's attention left me entirely unaffected." Edmund absorbed this admission with the same quiet dignity that characterized nearly everything he did, though Evelina could see the hurt in his expression, carefully controlled but present nonetheless. "I appreciate your honesty," he said eventually, "more than I can properly express. I would ask only that you take whatever time you need to understand your own feelings, rather than allowing my affection, or the Duke's, to pressure you toward a decision you have not truly reached on your own." It was, Evelina thought, exactly the kind of generous, thoughtful response she had come to expect from him, and it made the whole situation feel considerably worse rather than better, knowing how genuinely he deserved better than the confusion she had brought into their relationship. She returned home that evening with her thoughts in considerable disarray, uncertain how to proceed with either man, uncertain even what proceeding would mean given how little the Duke had actually offered beyond a single unfinished conversation, and the vague, unsettling sense that something had shifted between them during her stay at Ravensworth Hall. The winter season, when it began in earnest, brought the Duke back into regular proximity with Evelina at the usual round of balls and dinners, and she found, to her considerable frustration, that his manner toward her had grown noticeably warmer, more attentive, though never so obviously so as to generate scandal beyond the rumors already circulating. He sought her out at nearly every gathering they both attended, engaging her in conversation that felt increasingly personal, increasingly removed from the careful formality that governed most society interactions. And Evelina found herself, despite every reasonable argument against it, growing more entangled with each passing week rather than less. Lady Constance Vane's watchfulness had, by this point, evolved into something closer to open concern, and Evelina overheard, quite by accident, a fragment of conversation between the Duke and his aunt during a dinner party, in which Lady Constance's voice carried an unmistakable note of warning. "You cannot continue showing such particular attention to a young woman of modest fortune, Julian, without either committing to her properly or ceasing the attention entirely. You risk her reputation as much as your own with this ambiguity, and I would remind you that the succession requires more than affection to secure it properly." Evelina did not hear the Duke's response, having moved quickly away from the doorway before either of them noticed her presence, but the overheard fragment troubled her considerably in the days that followed, forcing her to confront a question she had been avoiding since her return from Ravensworth Hall. If the Duke's attention toward her was genuine, why had he not acted upon it more decisively, beyond conversations that, however meaningful they felt in the moment, ultimately led nowhere? And if it was not genuine, if it was simply the passing curiosity of a man grown tired of more calculated pursuits, then what was she doing, allowing it to unravel the genuine, steady affection she had built with a man who had never once made her question where she stood with him? It was with these unresolved questions weighing heavily on her mind that Evelina attended, several weeks later, a grand ball hosted by the Fenwick family, an event that would prove, in ways she could not yet anticipate, to bring the tangled situation between herself, the Duke, and Edmund Hale to a head far sooner than she had expected, and in a manner far more public than she would ever have chosen for herself. Julian Vane stood at the edge of his study window long after the household had retired for the night, watching the bare branches of the garden trees sway against a sky heavy with the promise of winter rain, and found himself, not for the first time in recent weeks, entirely unable to settle his thoughts enough for sleep. His aunt's words from the Fenwick dinner party continued to circle through his mind with uncomfortable persistence, not because he disagreed with the substance of her warning, but because he recognized, with growing discomfort, how completely he had failed to act on feelings he could no longer pretend did not exist. He had spent 3 full seasons, he realized now, moving through London society with a careful, deliberate blindness, so focused on avoiding the calculated pursuits of women who valued his title above his character that he had failed entirely to notice the one woman who had never pursued him at all, who had, if anything, seemed content to let him remain a distant, uninteresting figure in her own considerably fuller life. He thought of Evelina Ashworth's quiet dignity, so unlike the practiced performances he had grown accustomed to enduring, and felt a fresh wave of something close to shame at how thoroughly he had overlooked her. It had not been until Ravensworth Hall, until those quiet mornings in the garden and the still afternoon on the lake, that he had truly seen her at all, and even then he understood now. He had allowed the moment to pass unfinished, too cautious, too accustomed to guarding himself against attachment, to say plainly what he had begun to feel. He had told himself in the weeks since that there would be time, that their paths would cross again, and he would find the proper words, the proper moment, to make his intentions clear. He had not counted on the rumors that would follow their fortnight together, nor on the particular hurt he had witnessed, however briefly, on Evelina's face at the Fenwick ball, when she had appeared on Edmund Hale's arm, the two of them standing close together with an easy familiarity that had struck Julian with an unexpected, uncomfortable force. He had watched them from across the room for longer than propriety strictly allowed, watched the way Edmund Hale leaned toward Evelina to share some private observation, the way she laughed in response, easy and genuine, in a manner Julian realized, with growing discomfort, he had rarely managed to elicit from her himself despite his best efforts. He had told himself, standing there, that he had no right to feel the sharp, unfamiliar pang that settled in his chest at the sight, given how little he had actually offered her beyond careful, unfinished conversations that could easily be dismissed as nothing more than passing courtesy. And yet the feeling had refused to leave him, had followed him home from the Fenwick ball and settled into his thoughts with an insistence he could no longer ignore, forcing him to confront, in the quiet solitude of his study, exactly what he had allowed to happen over the course of 3 seasons and a single fortnight in the countryside. He had spent years, he realized now, so thoroughly focused on the obligations of his title, on the careful, calculated business of choosing a wife who would satisfy the requirements of lineage and fortune, that he had entirely failed to consider what he himself actually wanted, until a woman who wanted nothing from him at all had somehow become the only person whose company he genuinely craved. His friend Peter Lawson, calling upon him the following afternoon to discuss an unrelated matter of estate business, found the Duke in an unusually distracted mood, staring absently out the window rather than attending properly to the papers spread before them on the desk. "You are hardly present today, Julian," Peter observed, setting down his pen with an expression of amused curiosity. "I have asked you the same question twice now regarding the eastern boundary dispute, and received no answer either time." "My apologies," Julian said, though he made no immediate effort to return his attention to the matter at hand. "I find myself somewhat preoccupied." "With Miss Ashworth, I would wager," Peter said, and when Julian's sharp glance confirmed the guess, he laughed, not unkindly. "It is hardly a secret, Julian. Half the ton has been discussing your attention to her since Ravensworth Hall, and I confess I have been wondering myself when you would finally act on it, rather than simply watching her from across ballrooms with that particular expression you seem to reserve entirely for her." "I have not been watching her," Julian said, with considerably less conviction than he intended. "You have," Peter said cheerfully, "quite obviously, and I would suggest, as a friend who wishes to see you actually happy rather than merely properly married, that you stop wasting time and make your intentions known, before some sensible man with fewer complications recognizes her worth and secures her affections permanently. The observation struck Julian with uncomfortable force, given what he had witnessed at the Fenwick ball, and he found himself, over the following days, turning Peter's advice over in his mind with growing urgency. He had spent his entire adult life being careful, deliberate, weighing every decision against its impact on his title and his family's legacy, and he recognized now that this same carefulness, applied to matters of the heart, had cost him something he had not fully understood the value of until it seemed at genuine risk of slipping away entirely. He resolved, finally, to speak with Evelina directly, to set aside the careful ambiguity that had characterized every previous conversation between them, and simply tell her, plainly, what he had come to feel. But even as he made this resolution, doubt crept in alongside it, uncomfortable and persistent. What right did he have, after 3 seasons of near-total indifference, to suddenly demand her attention now, particularly when she appeared, by every account, to have found genuine happiness with a man who had never once made her question his regard? He thought of Edmund Hale's easy warmth, so different from his own careful reserve, and wondered whether his sudden interest was simply born of possessive jealousy rather than the genuine affection he told himself he felt. His aunt, sensing his continued preoccupation over the following weeks, finally addressed the matter directly one evening, finding him once again lost in thought over dinner rather than attending to the conversation around them. "You must decide, Julian," Lady Constance said, once the servants had cleared away the final course and left them alone, "whether you intend to pursue Miss Ashworth properly, or whether you intend to continue this strange half-attention that serves neither her interests nor your own. I have watched you struggle with this decision for weeks now, and I confess I grow tired of the uncertainty." "I do not know if I have any right to pursue her at all," Julian admitted, the honesty costing him considerable effort. "I ignored her for 3 full seasons, Aunt Constance. I gave her every reason to believe I found her entirely unremarkable, and now, when she has finally found genuine happiness elsewhere, I find myself wanting to disrupt it entirely for my own selfish reasons." Lady Constance studied her nephew with an expression that mixed exasperation with genuine affection, the particular combination she reserved for moments when she found his behavior both frustrating and, in some fundamental way, entirely understandable. "You are a fool, Julian, though a well-intentioned one. Miss Ashworth is not a possession to be claimed or a battle to be won through sheer persistence. But neither is genuine affection something to be discarded simply because you were too proud, or too cautious, to recognize it sooner. If you truly care for her, tell her so, plainly and honestly, and allow her the dignity of making her own choice with full knowledge of your feelings. Anything less is simply cowardice dressed up as consideration." The words settled over Julian with considerable weight, and he spent the following days turning them over repeatedly in his mind, gathering his courage for a conversation he knew could not be delayed much longer, particularly given the whispers that had begun to circulate regarding an imminent announcement between Evelina Ashworth and Edmund Hale. He learned, through channels he was not entirely proud of pursuing, that Edmund intended to formally request Evelina's hand within the coming weeks, and that her family, by every account, viewed the match with considerable approval, given the steady, genuine affection the young man had demonstrated over many months, in stark contrast to the Duke's own hesitant, ambiguous attention. Julian understood, with growing urgency, that whatever chance he had to make his own feelings known was rapidly narrowing, and he resolved, finally, to attend the next significant gathering where Evelina was expected to be present and speak with her plainly, regardless of the risk to his own pride, or the discomfort of potentially disrupting a courtship that appeared, by every reasonable measure, to be progressing exactly as it should toward a happy and well-suited conclusion. He did not yet know, as he made this resolution, that the gathering in question would prove to be the very evening on which Evelina's engagement to Edmund Hale was set to be announced, nor that he would arrive to find himself faced with a decision far more urgent and far more public than he had ever anticipated. The Ashworth family's modest but elegant townhouse had been transformed for the evening, every room filled with flowers and candlelight, in preparation for what Evelina's mother had spent the better part of a month arranging with meticulous care. It was to be, though Evelina herself had only learned the full extent of the plan 2 days prior, the evening on which Edmund Hale would formally announce his intention to marry her before their gathered families and closest friends. A modest but significant celebration meant to mark the beginning of a betrothal that would, by every reasonable measure, secure her future with a man of genuine warmth and steady devotion. Evelina had accepted Edmund's private proposal only a week earlier, following weeks of careful consideration during which she had finally, deliberately, set aside the confusion the Duke's attention had stirred within her, choosing instead the certain, comfortable happiness that Edmund had offered so consistently and so genuinely throughout their long friendship. She had told herself, in reaching this decision, that she was choosing wisely, choosing a man who had never once made her question where she stood with him, over the uncertain, unfinished promise of a duke who had spent 3 seasons treating her as though she scarcely existed at all before finally, belatedly, beginning to notice her. It should have felt, she told herself repeatedly in the days leading up to the announcement, like an easy and obvious choice, and in many ways it was. Edmund's kindness was not in question, nor his genuine affection, nor the comfortable, steady life she could reasonably expect to build alongside him. And yet, as she dressed for the evening in a gown of soft ivory silk that her mother had chosen specifically for the occasion, Evelina found herself unable to entirely shake a small, persistent ache, a quiet awareness that some part of her heart remained tangled with a possibility she had deliberately chosen to set aside. The guests began arriving shortly after 7, filling the drawing room with the particular warm hum of a gathering that anticipated happy news, and Evelina found herself, for the first hour, genuinely swept up in the celebratory atmosphere, greeting familiar faces, and accepting early congratulations from those who had already guessed at the evening's purpose, despite her family's attempts at discretion. Charlotte Byron arrived early, embracing her warmly before drawing back to study her expression with the particular scrutiny that had characterized their friendship for years. "You look happy," Charlotte said, though something in her tone suggested she was searching for confirmation rather than simply offering observation. "I am happy," Evelina said, and found, to her relief, that the words felt largely true. "Edmund has been nothing but good to me, Charlotte. I would be foolish not to recognize the value of that." "You would," Charlotte agreed, though she continued studying her friend's expression a moment longer before finally offering a genuine, warm smile and allowing the matter to rest, apparently satisfied by whatever she had found in Evelina's answer. It was nearing 8 o'clock, with the formal announcement expected within the hour, when a commotion near the front entrance drew Evelina's attention away from a conversation with her aunt, and she turned to find, with a jolt of surprise that stole the breath from her chest entirely, the unmistakable figure of Julian Vane, Duke of Kelmore, standing in the doorway of her family's drawing room, his expression a mixture of urgency and something else. Something raw and unguarded that she had glimpsed only once before, on a quiet moonlit balcony months earlier. The room's conversation faltered noticeably as guests began to notice the unexpected arrival, whispers rippling outward as attendees registered the significance of a duke appearing, uninvited and unannounced, at what was widely understood to be a betrothal celebration for another man entirely. Evelina's mother appeared at her elbow within moments, her expression a mixture of confusion and barely concealed alarm, though she said nothing, apparently as uncertain as everyone else regarding the proper response to such an extraordinary intrusion. Julian crossed the room directly toward Evelina, seemingly oblivious to the whispers and stares that followed his progress, his focus entirely fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart pound with a confusion of emotions she could not begin to untangle in the moment. "Miss Ashworth," he said, stopping before her, his voice carrying clearly enough that those nearby could not help but overhear, though he seemed for once entirely unconcerned with the impropriety of the scene he was creating. "I must speak with you." I know the timing is unforgivable, and I know I have no right to interrupt this evening, but I could not allow it to proceed without saying what I should have said months ago or years ago, if I had possessed the sense to recognize it sooner. Evelina, acutely aware of every eye in the room now fixed upon them, felt a rising panic at the public nature of the scene unfolding, mixed with a bewildering, unwelcome flutter of hope that she immediately tried to suppress. "Your Grace, this is hardly the appropriate moment." "I know," he interrupted, his voice quieter now, though no less urgent. "I know it is not appropriate, and I know I am asking a great deal by requesting even a few moments of your time this evening, of all evenings. But I have spent 3 seasons overlooking you entirely, Evelina, and months, since Ravensworth Hall being too cautious, too proud, to say plainly what I felt, and I find I cannot allow you to make a decision that will shape the rest of your life without at least knowing the full truth of my own feelings." Edmund Hale, who had been standing nearby engaged in conversation with Evelina's father, turned at the sound of the commotion and made his way toward them, his expression carefully controlled, though Evelina could see the genuine hurt and confusion beneath the composure. "Your Grace," he said, his voice steady despite the obvious tension of the moment, "I believe you are interrupting an evening that belongs to Miss Ashworth and myself." "I am aware," Julian said, turning to face him directly, and something in his manner, despite the extraordinary awkwardness of the situation, carried genuine respect rather than the dismissive arrogance one might have expected from a man of his rank addressing a gentleman of considerably lesser standing. "I do not come here to disrupt your happiness out of spite, Mr. Hale, nor do I claim any right to demand Miss Ashworth's affection simply because I have finally recognized its value. I come only because I believe she deserves to make her choice with full knowledge of every possibility available to her, rather than in ignorance of feelings I was too foolish to voice sooner." The room had fallen almost entirely silent now, every guest watching the extraordinary scene unfold with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, and Evelina felt the weight of every gaze pressing upon her as she stood caught between the two men, each offering, in their own way, a claim to her heart that she had not expected to face so publicly, nor so suddenly. She looked between them, Edmund's steady, wounded dignity and Julian's raw, unguarded urgency, and felt, for a long, agonizing moment, entirely uncertain how to proceed. "I need a moment," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to steady it. "Away from this room, if you would both permit me that." She did not wait for their response, moving instead toward the small adjoining study where her father conducted his private correspondence, the room mercifully empty and quiet compared to the charged atmosphere she had left behind. She pressed her hands against the cool surface of her father's desk, taking several steadying breaths, attempting to untangle the confusion of emotions that had overwhelmed her so completely in the space of a few short minutes. She heard the door open softly behind her and turned to find Julian standing in the doorway, his expression uncertain now, none of the bold urgency that had carried him through the drawing room remaining visible. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I did not intend to create such a scene, nor to place you in such an impossible position. I simply could not bear the thought of your engagement being announced while I remained silent about feelings I should have voiced long ago." "Why now?" Evelina asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though the question carried the full weight of 3 years of confusion and quiet hope and disappointment. "Why did you say nothing during my first season, or my second, or even after Ravensworth Hall, when you had every opportunity to speak plainly then? Why tonight of all evenings, when it is almost certainly too late for whatever you have come to say?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on hers despite the evident difficulty of the admission he was working toward. "I do not have a good answer, Evelina, beyond my own foolish pride and the particular blindness that comes from spending one's entire life surrounded by people who want something from you rather than simply wanting your company. I did not recognize what I felt until it was already deeply rooted, and even then I told myself there would be time, that I need not rush toward honesty when careful patience seemed the safer course. I was wrong. I understand that now, perhaps too late to matter, but I could not let tonight pass without at least telling you the truth, regardless of what you choose to do with it." Evelina studied his face for a long moment, searching for whatever certainty might help her navigate the impossible choice suddenly laid before her, aware, even as she did so, that the answer she gave in the coming moments would shape the entire course of her future, regardless of which path she ultimately chose. The study remained quiet for a long moment, the muffled sound of the gathered guests still audible through the closed door, and Evelina found herself studying Julian's face with the same careful attention she had once reserved for watching him across crowded ballrooms, searching now for something more than mere handsomeness or composure, searching for the truth beneath his words. "You ask a great deal of me tonight, Your Grace," she said finally. "You ask me to weigh 3 years of near-total indifference against a single evening of urgent honesty, and to make that judgment while the man who has never once made me doubt his affection waits in the very next room, expecting to announce our betrothal before our closest family and friends." "I know," Julian said, and the simple honesty of the admission carried more weight than any elaborate defense might have offered. "I have no right to ask anything of you at all, Evelina, given how thoroughly I failed to recognize your worth when it would have cost me so little to do so. I do not come here tonight expecting you to simply set aside a genuine, steady affection for the uncertain promise of my own belated feelings. I come only because I could not live with the alternative, with allowing you to walk into a lifetime commitment without knowing that another man, however flawed and however late in his recognition, had come to care for you more deeply than he had ever anticipated caring for anyone." Evelina felt tears gathering unbidden at the raw honesty of the admission, though she could not have said with certainty whether they sprang from relief or grief, or simply the overwhelming weight of the choice now facing her. "I care for Edmund," she said quietly. "I care for him deeply, Julian. He has never once made me feel invisible, never once left me uncertain of where I stood with him. That is not a small thing, whatever grand feelings you have discovered tonight." "I know it is not," Julian agreed, and something in his voice suggested genuine respect for Edmund rather than the dismissive rivalry one might have expected. "I would not ask you to abandon that certainty for nothing, Evelina. I ask only that you allow yourself to choose with full knowledge, rather than choosing in ignorance of what I feel simply because I lack the courage to speak sooner. Whatever you decide tonight, I will respect it, though I confess it will cost me a great deal to watch you choose otherwise, knowing now what I might have offered you, had I recognized it in time." The door opened quietly then, and Edmund Hale stepped into the study, his expression carefully composed though the strain of the evening was evident in the tightness around his eyes. "I believe," he said, addressing them both with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his entire courtship of Evelina, "that this decision belongs entirely to Evelina, and that neither of us has any right to influence it further through our own presence or persuasion. I will withdraw if she wishes it, and allow her the space to consider her own heart without either of us pressing our case." Evelina looked between the two men, Edmund's steady, generous dignity and Julian's raw, belated honesty, and felt, for the first time that evening, a strange and unexpected clarity begin to settle over her confusion. "I do not think," she said slowly, working through the thought even as she spoke it aloud, "that I can make this decision standing between you both in my father's study, with an entire drawing room of guests waiting to hear the outcome of a moment I never asked to be forced into. I need time. Real time, not simply a few stolen minutes between the announcement everyone expects and the scene Your Grace has created tonight." She turned to Edmund first, her voice softening with genuine affection and genuine regret in equal measure. "Edmund, you deserve so much better than to have your proposal answered under these circumstances, with another man's confession still hanging in the air between us. I care for you, truly, and nothing that has happened tonight changes the genuine value of the friendship and affection we have built together. But I cannot, in good conscience, agree to marry you tonight, not while I remain uncertain whether I am choosing you freely or simply choosing the safer, more certain path out of fear of the alternative." Edmund absorbed this with visible difficulty, though he nodded slowly, his expression carrying more understanding than Evelina had any right to expect given the circumstances. "I would rather you take the time you need," he said quietly, "than accept me out of obligation or uncertainty. I have always wanted your genuine choice, Evelina, not merely your acceptance. If that means waiting, or even losing you entirely to feelings I cannot compete with, then I would rather know the truth of your heart than build a marriage on anything less." He left the room then, with quiet, careful dignity, and Evelina felt the weight of his generosity settle over her like both a comfort and a fresh wave of guilt, knowing how much pain she had caused a man who deserved nothing but genuine happiness. She turned back to Julian, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, watching with an expression that mixed hope and genuine remorse in equal measure. "I am not agreeing to anything tonight," she said firmly, meeting his gaze directly. "Not to you and not to Edmund either. I need time to understand my own heart clearly, without the pressure of a room full of guests or the urgency of a scene neither of us chose. If your feelings are genuine, Julian, they will survive the wait. And if mine prove genuine in return, I will tell you so, when I am ready and not before." "That is more than fair," Julian said, something like relief crossing his expression despite the uncertainty of what she had offered him. "I will wait as long as you need, Evelina, and I will not press you further until you come to me yourself, if you choose to come at all." The announcement, needless to say, did not proceed as planned that evening, and Evelina spent the following weeks in a quiet, deliberate withdrawal from society, declining most invitations and spending her days instead in careful reflection, walking the same countryside paths that had once helped her navigate the confusion of her earliest seasons, seeking clarity in solitude rather than in the crowded, watchful eyes of the ton. She spoke with Charlotte at length, and with her mother, and even once with Edmund himself, in a conversation marked by genuine warmth despite the sadness underlying it, as they both acknowledged, with mutual respect, that whatever had existed between them had perhaps always been more friendship than the deeper passion a lifelong marriage required. It was nearly a month later, on a cold evening with snow beginning to fall softly over London's quiet streets, that Evelina finally found the clarity she had been seeking, understanding at last that her feelings for Julian, however inconveniently timed and however complicated by 3 years of near-total indifference, had grown into something real and undeniable, something that had, if she was entirely honest with herself, been quietly taking root since a masked conversation on a moonlit balcony months before. She understood, too, that choosing him would require more than simply accepting his belated attention. It would require him to prove, through consistent and genuine effort, that the man who had finally noticed her was prepared to spend the rest of his life ensuring she never felt invisible again. She wrote to him that evening, a brief note requesting his presence at her family's home the following day, and spent the intervening hours in a state of nervous anticipation, unlike anything she had experienced during 3 full seasons of watching him from across crowded ballrooms. When he arrived the next afternoon, his expression carrying the same careful hope it had held since that extraordinary evening in her father's study, Evelina found herself, for the first time in their long and complicated acquaintance, entirely certain of what she wished to say. "I have thought of little else these past weeks," she told him, as they sat together in her family's quiet drawing room, the winter light filtering softly through the windows. "And I have come to understand that my feelings for you are genuine, Julian, however unexpected and however inconveniently they arrived. But I will not simply accept your affection as though the past 3 years never happened. If you wish to court me properly, you must do so with the same patience and genuine attention you finally showed me at Ravensworth Hall, and you must understand that I will not be overlooked again, not by you, and not by anyone else who might someday take your place in my life." "I understand," Julian said, and the genuine relief and determination in his expression told her, more clearly than any words could have, that he meant it fully. "I will not make the mistake of taking your presence for granted again, Evelina. You have my word, for whatever it is worth after 3 seasons of failing to earn it." Their courtship, which followed over the subsequent months, unfolded with none of the careful, calculated distance that had characterized the Duke's previous approach to matters of marriage, and everything of the genuine warmth and attention Evelina had always deserved. He called upon her regularly, accompanied her to her charitable work on more than one occasion despite his own considerable unfamiliarity with such labor, and slowly, steadily, proved himself to be exactly the man she had glimpsed only in fragments during their earlier, unfinished conversations. A man capable of genuine partnership rather than mere ceremonial attention. Their wedding, when it finally took place the following spring, was a considerably grander affair than Evelina had ever imagined for herself during those early, uncertain seasons of feeling invisible in crowded ballrooms. Though she found, standing before the gathered guests in a gown of pale gold silk, that the grandeur mattered far less to her than the simple, steady certainty in Julian's eyes as he watched her walk toward him. Charlotte stood among her attendants, having long since forgiven the awkwardness of the affair for the genuine happiness it had ultimately produced, and even Edmund Hale, who had gone on to court and eventually marry a kind young widow from his own charitable circles, attended the ceremony with genuine warmth rather than any lingering bitterness. As Evelina exchanged her vows with the man who had once ignored her presence entirely across 3 long seasons, she thought back to that first ball, to the sharp, private disappointment of being looked at and looked past, and felt a quiet, profound gratitude that she had never allowed that early indifference to diminish her own sense of worth. She had built a life of genuine substance during those years of waiting, friendships and purpose, and a clear understanding of her own value that no man's attention, however grand his title, could have given her. And when Julian had finally, belatedly, come to recognize what he had nearly lost forever, she had been ready, whole and certain of herself, to meet him not as the overlooked girl of her first season, but as a woman entirely capable of choosing her own happiness, on her own terms at last. The first year of their marriage settled into a rhythm neither Julian nor Evelina had fully anticipated, one built not on the careful distance of dukes and duchesses performing their roles for society, but on genuine partnership that surprised even those closest to them. Evelina continued her charitable work, and to the considerable astonishment of the ton, Julian began accompanying her there several mornings a week, learning the names of the children she taught and slowly discovering, as she had promised him he might, a kind of satisfaction in useful labor that his years of estate management had never quite provided. Lady Constance Vane, who had once viewed Evelina with cautious suspicion, became over that first year an unexpected and genuine ally, visiting Kelmore House frequently, and offering Evelina the kind of practical guidance that came from decades of navigating society's more complicated corners. "I confess," she admitted one afternoon, watching Evelina review the household accounts with the same careful attention she brought to everything else, "I did not believe my nephew capable of recognizing genuine worth over mere polish. I am glad, for both your sakes, that I was wrong." Not every challenge of that first year proved so easily resolved. Rosalind Fenwick, whose own courtship of Julian had ended years earlier in quiet disappointment, remained a fixture of society circles, and her presence at gatherings occasionally stirred old whispers about what might have been, whispers that Evelina, secure in her own marriage though she was, found she still had to learn to set aside rather than allow to trouble her. It was Julian himself who addressed the matter most directly, one evening after a particularly pointed comment from a mutual acquaintance had left Evelina unusually quiet during their carriage ride home. "You need not compare yourself to anyone, least of all to a courtship that never held the substance ours has," he told her, taking her hand in the dim carriage light. "I spent 3 seasons failing to recognize what mattered, Evelina, and I promise you, I have never once regretted the years since I finally did." Their first child, a daughter they named after Evelina's own mother, arrived the following winter, and the household that had once seemed defined entirely by careful ceremony grew instead into something warmer and considerably louder, filled with the particular chaos of a young family finding its footing. Charlotte Byron, who had married a barrister of considerable wit and modest fortune the same year as Evelina's own wedding, remained a constant presence in her life, their friendship deepening rather than fading, as both women navigated the early years of marriage and motherhood together. Edmund Hale, for his part, built a genuinely contented life alongside his own wife, and the friendship between the two families, though occasionally awkward in its earliest days, settled eventually into something Evelina treasured, a quiet testament to the fact that not every important relationship in her life needed to end in romance to hold genuine value. She often thought, in later years, of how differently things might have unfolded had Julian arrived at her betrothal celebration only a single day later, and found herself endlessly grateful that fate, however inconveniently timed, had granted her the chance to choose with clarity rather than settling for certainty alone. Julian, for his part, never entirely forgave himself for the 3 seasons he had spent overlooking her, though Evelina worked steadily over the years to help him release that particular burden of guilt. "You noticed me eventually," she told him once, many years later, as they walked together through the same gardens where their courtship had truly begun. "And you have spent every day since making certain I never feel invisible again. That is worth considerably more than 3 seasons of belated attention, Julian. That is worth an entire lifetime." He had smiled at that, the same rare, unguarded smile she had first glimpsed on a moonlit balcony so many years before, and drawn her close, grateful beyond words that the first night without her, the night he had so nearly allowed to pass unchallenged, had instead become the beginning of every night that followed, spent finally and fully in her company, exactly where he had all along belonged.